The first weapon wasn't a gun. It was a silence designed to make you doubt your own eyes. They called it a cordon, a compliance ring woven from paperwork and drones. No salvos, no proclamations, just 1,000 small inconveniences calibrated into a slow suffocation. A tug denied fuel because a form was misfiled. A clinic shipment logged as misrouted. A beacon that pinged for help and met a yawn with a spreadsheet. The Galactic Council had learned its lesson in the worst way. Titans made grand gestures impossible. So the next move would be smaller, quieter, deniable, the kind of harm you can deny while smiling into a camera. Ambassador Elena Vasquez watched it unfold in real time across 3 walls of light in the quiet room under the Pacific. She drew a circle on the glass around a cluster of waypoints labeled Orpheus Lane, a trade artery that fed 15 minor worlds and 100,000 lives that never got named in council minutes. They won't call it a blockade, she said. They'll call it calibration. Admiral Sarah Chen, stone still beside her, nodded once. 1,000 knots tied in the dark. Commander Oluwasegun Adebayo kept the casualty estimates in his throat and not on the table. Council proxies, merchant guild shells, private security with letters of marque that dissolve in sunlight. Sunlight is banned at their meetings, Elena said dryly. Then she tapped the corner of the glass where an old symbol glowed in dim blue, an outline of a lighthouse with the word Pharaohs cut from the sea. Titans hold the open lanes, but they built this to be beneath the Titans' notice. Paper doesn't trip a battleship's alarms. Paper cuts arteries, Adebayo said. Chen set a small, battered notebook on the table. It had water-warped corners and handwriting that slanted like a wind off the South China Sea. Doctrine, the answer that doesn't announce itself. Below the title, an old sentence. A lighthouse does not seek storms. It stands where storms pretend to be ordinary weather. We knew they'd learn, Chen said, so we learned first. She turned the page. Project Echo, then Hush, then the name that stuck because sailors love humor. Her mouth almost smiled. Phantom, Yelena's eyes sharpened. You finished it. We finished the part that matters, Chen said. The ethics, then the physics, then the ships, in that order. Across the lane, lives contracted. The miners of Gliza 408 sold wedding bands to buy bribes that had new names each week. A teacher on Dio's market taught a lesson on fractions with empty shelves as props. A paramedic on Clytemnestra watched a container of oxygen scrubbers sit 4 docks away because an inspector preferred the taste of fear to coffee. No one took a shot, no one threw a punch, and yet throats closed a little more each day. The council spokespeople were good at their jobs. They sighed, promised inquiries, and praised the complexity of interstellar logistics. A grandmother on Dio's market did not understand logistics but understood the price of rice. She wrote a number in chalk on her door. The number went up. The number is a language every empire eventually has to read. Elena tapped the glass again. We cannot keep making speeches in rooms built to turn speeches into echoes. We have to answer where they don't expect an answer. Chen's silence changed shape. It became decision. They expect titans. They expect declarations. Give them neither. Give them a pattern that cancels their pattern, not louder, quieter. Adebayo closed his eyes for a beat as if listening to a distant surf, and then began calling numbers no camera would catch, frequencies that never used words, rendezvous points no registry admitted, crews who had trained for years in the negative space between law and physics. Names surfaced in the room like constellations seen from a cold hill. Captain Murray Park, late of the series Pilots Guild, Systems Chief Mateo Rios, who could teach an engine to whisper, Commodore Inez Okafor, who had once convinced a cyclone to change its mind by building a better pressure gradient. Elena looked down at her hands. They were the hands of a Rivertown mechanic's granddaughter, scarred by honest work, steady when the bearings spun hot. What is the first rule? She asked quietly. Chen turned the notebook back to the beginning, tapping a line written in stubborn ink. When you must vanish, leave a school behind you. She lifted her gaze. Phantom doesn't erase. Phantom teaches the room the shape of a future where the trick no longer works. Above the Pacific, clouds rolled like armies with no generals. Under them, shipwrights laid hands on hulls that did not reflect, not just matte, absent. Panels that made radar read last year's weather. Lattice that taught gravity to distribute blame elsewhere. Drives that left contrails composed entirely of mistakes your instruments believed you had made. Elena leaned forward. They'll call us smugglers. Let them, Adebeo said. Smuggling medicine past a lie is a sacrament. Chen placed her palm on the table and the room darkened a fraction, just enough to make focus a physical thing. Begin the rehearsals, she said. No victory laps, no logos. If someone takes a picture, the picture should embarrass them later. From Lagrange shadows and the lungs of forgotten caverns, a different kind of fleet stood, not at attention, because ghosts do not salute, but at readiness, because ghosts have work. The council looked at the sky and saw nothing new. The right kind of nothing is the loudest warning a bully will never recognize until the chalk numbers stop going up. We didn't build ships to be unseen. We built ships to unteach a lie. The first Phantom hull was assembled in a place maps forgot by request. It wore no name at launch. That came later when it had earned one. Workers wrapped its bones in lattice grown, not riveted. Carbon threads spun like spider silk around a memory of storms. Above that, metamaterial panels that ate radar, drank lidar, and fed sonar the sound of an empty chair. Around the drives, a cage that taught space to drift just a hair. So that prediction would always miss by a polite, maddening margin. Mateo Rios stood under the ribs and listened. He always listened before he measured. Engines, like people, hide their intentions in rhythm long before they show them in motion. She hums in a minor, he told Captain Murray Park, who made a note without asking why. On Phantom ships, why often arrives after listen. Commodore Inez Okafor brought the doctrine. Not the physics, that was Rios. And a dozen alumni of places where math classes doubled as poetry clubs, but the ethics, the choreography that would keep cleverness from rotting into cruelty. She wrote it in one page because anything longer breeds loopholes and anything shorter breeds arrogance. Phantom rules of use. 1. We erase signatures, not people. 2. We jam weapons, we do not delete memory. 3. We close doors only to open better ones in public. 4. We leave receipts. Someone must be able to audit our mercy. Murray read the rules aloud before every sim. She did it softly, like a prayer before the engines woke. The crews learn negative space tactics, how to be the absence that reveals a shape, how to remove the single screw from the bully's chair, so he falls at just the moment a camera meant to flatter him begins to roll. Training looked like failure to anyone who wanted fireworks. Phantom pilots missed on purpose, hundreds of times, until miss became pattern and pattern became art. They practiced arriving late by nanoseconds, so sensors built their reports around the wrong moment. They drilled not being the story until even their egos found nobility in it. They practiced leaving behind a school, a document, a tool, a habit that made their own future appearances less necessary. Murray flew the prototype in vacuum so empty the stars sounded like dust. She trusted the lattice. She trusted Rios, who had never lied to a screw. She trusted Okafor, who believed that every weapon can be tuned into a lesson if you attend to it like a teacher with a difficult child. They named the ship Quiet Oath after its first successful pass, slipping a morphine pallet onto a clinic deck while the inspector's pen inexplicably ran out of ink for 47 seconds. In the quiet room, Elena watched the lane's chalk numbers climb slower. Not stop, stall. The difference matters like oxygen. Their inspectors are getting annoyed. Yadebio reported almost cheerfully. Annoyance is the emotion of a greedy man discovering he must write better paperwork. Chen didn't smile. She looked tired in a way steel looks after it has held a bridge through a spring flood. Next phase, she said, teach the room. That meant public sabotage, not of ships, not of lives, but of the trick itself. Phantom crews began to leave behind tools the way a good teacher leaves behind charts on the wall, a tamper-evident seal design that any child could check, an index of euphemisms that convert delayed humanitarian shipment into bribe required, a little box the size of a locket that chirped when a corridor was being silently taxed by a private algorithm. Free, open, embarrassing. They also left stories. Mateo recorded the hums of the engines and pressed them into a song a child could hum. Murray wrote instructions for a mother with no time and less patience. If the official tells you to move 3 times and always points left, go right. There is a pattern. Trust your hunger more than their map. Okafor soldered a proverb into the circuitry of every panel. If a door closes, look for the hinge, not the lock. The council noticed the hinge. New memos went out with new euphemisms and new fees. The chalk numbers rose again, slower, then stalled again longer. News feeds carried more exposés suddenly. Not because the council grew brave, but because auditors who were not quite corrupt saw light on their own paperwork and found their souls itching. Then the lane hiccuped in a different way. Drones that had never failed started scheduling maintenance every fourth hour. Inspectors began to experience a new annoying defect, empathy. It turns out empathy is contagious when the room makes it safe to be brave. A mid-level official at Kite's Cross signed a waiver he wasn't supposed to sign. He went home with his heart hammering and a note in his mailbox. You did right. Breathe. Murray understood that victory was not a roar. It was a softening. She also understood that softening attracts those who sell hardness for a living. She sat with Okafor and Rios over noodles and wrote out the obvious next move. They roll in deniable muscle, she said. Not a fleet, a security evaluation team. Rios slurped broth. With toys. Then we'll teach the toys, Okafor said, folding the doctrine back into her pocket. And if they insist on a lesson delivered face to face. Murray finished the sentence with a pilot's calm. We step out of the chalk line. She looked up at the ceiling as if she could see the stars through the concrete. Quietly. Outside, the lane glittered with dots, ships, lives, hopes. Somewhere in that glitter, a grandmother erased yesterday's price and wrote a smaller number. The chalk made a soft noise. It sounded like a door unlearning how to be locked. A blockade doesn't need guns when it has 1,000 little hands at your throat. The security evaluation team arrived in a starched uniform called Regulus Assurance Partners and brought a flotilla of polite ships with impolite software. They smiled. They clapped inspectors on the back. They used words like risk hygiene and reputational load. Their mission brief had a line in small print. Subject lanes must exhibit latency sufficient to disincentivize illicit humanitarian traffic. A poet would have called it strangling without bruises. At Kite's Cross, the first week looked like competence. Containers moved on time, but the wrong containers. Medicine to bonded warehouses. Grain to climate-controlled rooms with velvet rope. Oxygen scrubbers to a cavern labeled dangerous materials that coincidentally included a waiting room and a credit office. Someone had found a way to play whack-a-mole with breath. Phantom watched. That was the rule. Watch until the trick repeats. Don't touch a machine until you can draw its gears blindfolded. Murray mapped the pattern on the bulkhead in grease pencil. A loop of 5 docs, 2 auditors, 1 AI that pretended to be stupid, and 1 that pretended to be wise. Rios scribbled numbers in the margins, delays, probabilities, the subtle drift in a clock that shouldn't drift. Okafor underlined 1 doc twice. Here, she said, they feed the loop here. They make it look random by rolling dice, but the dice have 3 sixes. When Phantom moved, no one saw them. They didn't become invisible. They became the kind of visible you don't write reports about. A tug misread a docking cone by half a degree. A text stylus lost its charge just as the randomized pick list appeared. A crane's bearing decided to squeal, and the crew, out of habit, not conspiracy, took 3 minutes to oil what didn't quite need oil. The loop stumbled. Grain fell where grain was meant to go. Oxygen scrubbers arrived where breath was turning into prayer. Regulus noticed. Denial turned into curiosity, curiosity into irritation. They sent for one of their toys, a compliance drone with a skin like night and a personality like a contemptuous cat. It spoke to docs in a dialect made of passwords, threats, and deadlines. It found the loop stutter and purred at it, stretched over it, restored it. Okafor leaned against the bulkhead of quiet oath and said, "Teach the toy." Rios tuned the ship to a frequency only the drone cared about. The thin whistle of its own pride. Murray flew not at the drone, but near its assumptions, sliding between clock ticks, laying a hand on the bearing at the exact moment it would squeal, cutting power on Doc 3's camera for a blink that no one human would notice, but that the drone would treat as a confession of guilt somewhere else. The drone followed the confession to the wrong door. Okafor placed a sticker on the right door that read, "This door lies to drones." A dock worker laughed, then swallowed the laugh, and then carefully left the sticker in place. A day later, dock workers everywhere had their own versions of the sticker. The toy had been taught by a room. Regulus escalated to flesh. 12 advisors arrived in armor you could call tasteful if you liked the taste of metal. They didn't shoot, they stood too close. They explained rules that changed when you blinked. Little hands on throats practiced in seminars. Phantom escalated to presence, not visibility, presence. The kind you feel when a teacher walks into a classroom where a fight is about to start. The temperature drops half a degree. Everyone hears their mother's voice saying their full name. It began with a hum, a minor in the deck plates and the ducts and the pens that had always written smoothly. The hum said, "We are here, don't embarrass your ancestors." The advisors laughed. Then they stopped laughing when their armor started reporting phantom impacts that never arrived but kept arriving. Step left, nothing. Step right, bonk, a gentle nudge with the emotional weight of a disapproving ant. One advisor removed his helmet and discovered the air smelled like rain in a city that remembers its trees. Akafor stepped into their path with the slow authority of a tide. No weapon visible, doctrine visible. "This is a hospital, a courtroom, and a school," she said. "Choose what you want to be in. Who are you?" Their leader asked, eyes trying to pin her to a registry. She offered a card that said only, "We leave receipts." On the back, a short list of shipments delivered on time this week with signatures. "Audit us," she said. "Audit yourselves harder." The advisors did not shoot. The room made shooting silly. Phantom had edited the context, not the men. Beside Doc, too. A grandmother with chalk on her fingers coughed in a way that made even bureaucrats hear their own lungs. The leader looked at his men. They were listening to the hum. Murray watched from shadow. Rios adjusted the frequency by a breath. Adebayo's voice in her ear. "Hold, let them choose their dignity." Regulus submitted a terse report. "Unfavorable conditions for reputational dominance. Recommend tactical reset." In boardrooms far above anyone's oxygen ration, someone grimaced and approved contingency operations. The kind that don't put logos on armor. The kind that shoot. Phantom had known this page of the playbook too. You teach a room to be brave, and the next day you have to be the wall that bravery can stand behind. Murray drew a loop on the bulkhead again. It ended at Rathari Station, the lane's throat. "They'll bring a cutter, fast, clean, no insignia." Akafor placed her palm on the map as if blessing it. "Then we do the thing we built these ships to do exactly once." Rios looked up. Step out, Akafor said softly. The words tasted like thunder kept in a jar too long. Answer without announcement. The chalk numbers paused for an hour that stretched like a held breath. The lane heard a minor in its bones and learned a new vowel for courage. Somewhere beyond the radar, where instruments showed only yesterday, something old and patient, not a titan, turned its face toward Kite's Cross. The radar showed an empty sky. Then a mountain moved across their bridge like a shadow with opinions. The cutter came in black and quiet, a blade of a hull with lights that never blinked. No insignia, no registry, an accountant's dream of violence, efficient, deniable, billable. Its captain trusted math and men and the cowardice that scarcity breeds. He had read the reports. He believed in loops you choke and in people you price. He did not believe in ships that taught space to forget them. Not yet. Quiet oath arrived first, no trumpet. Just a slight change in how the station's windows caught starlight. Murray slid the hull into a seam Regulus's software did not admit existed and held there, wrapped in a probability haze that made forecasters argue with their screens. Rios murmured to the drive and taught it a different lullaby, one that would slow any projectile that entered a certain cube of air until it forgot what impact meant. Akafor stepped to the intercom and spoke the rules again. Erase signatures. Not people, jam weapons, not memory. Close doors to open better ones in public. Leave receipts. The cutter lit its lances. On every display, targets resolved. A clinic, a tug, a grandmother's apartment that had the bad luck to be next to a pipe labeled vital. The first lance screamed and went to school. The cube of air learned by Rios accepted the lance like a calm teacher receives a thrown book. Its kinetic arrogance melted into numbers that made the lance yawn, apologize, and drift like a confused fish. The cutter corrected. The second lance spit. Murray moved quiet oath not into its path, but into the memory the lance would use to compute its path. The lance chose a past that wasn't there anymore. It missed a thing that had never existed and wrote to the cutter. Target destroyed. The cutter's captain smiled at a victory he could not see because victory lived only inside a log he would later present to people who did not go outside. Then something else entered the room. No radar painted it. No lidar stroked it. The cutter's crew felt it in the bones that evolution grew long before screens. Shadow, a pressure like a wave that never breaks, a refusal. The station's windows darkened the way a city grows quiet for a funeral and then bright for a birth. Dock workers looked up and saw a shape that wasn't a shape, an absence defined by the presence it demanded from the people below. A hull emerged from denial the way truth emerges from a well, wet, unbothered, inevitable. It wore no flag. It wore no number. The name came across every channel in the lane as a courtesy, not a requirement, unwritten. It did not threaten, it declared a context. This corridor is a hospital, a courtroom, and a school. Weapons sleep, hands work. There will be no heroics, no humiliations, no martyrs. There will be audits. The cutter fired anyway because some men think dignity is a zero-sum game. The bolts went where courage goes when it isn't taught, nowhere. Unwritten's halo, different from a Titan's, smaller, more precise, flexed. The cutter's drives remembered a childhood nap and took it. The hull cooled. The captain's headset filled with a sound like rain deciding to be kind. Murray exhaled. Rios took his hands off the board. Okafor spoke, not to the cutter, but to the room. "We do not erase you," she said, voice carrying in the bones of the station like a drum in a village night. "We ask you to write better." She transmitted a packet to everyone. An audit of fees, names of shell companies, the line where the council's deniability rubbed a blister on truth. She appended a receipt, shipments delivered during the last hour, signed by dock workers who spelled their names slowly because nobody had asked them to sign anything that mattered before. The cutter's captain sat alone with his blinking boards and chose not to die for a spreadsheet. He powered down. In that small act was a revolution quieter than any anthem, a man deciding to live and to let others live because the room made it possible to tell the story of retreat without shame. Across Orpheus Lane, ships without radar signatures stepped out of the negative space as if the universe had been saving their outlines for a better day. Not all at once, never spectacle. One above Rathari, two over Kite's Cross, another at Dio's Market where a grandmother put down her chalk and wiped her hands on her apron in disbelief. Their hulls glowed like mathematics seen from the right angle. Their names carried like good gossip, quiet oath, unwritten, vanishing point. Gentle proof, a dozen more that would never trend because trending isn't teaching. They didn't fire. They set conditions. They jammed weapons into sleep and shame. They escorted oxygen scrubbers the size of houses as if escorting a bride through a jealous crowd. They issued open-source tools. They left behind posters with 3 rules in big letters and a 4th in smaller script: audit us. Auditors came. Some came to catch ghosts and stayed to rebuild offices. Elena watched the chalk numbers drop. She didn't cheer. She sat with her hands folded and the tired, private gratitude of someone who has cleaned something that most people never notice until it shines. Chen stood beside her and said nothing for a long time. Then, "They will hate us for making their tricks unmarketable." "Yes," Elena said, "and love us in the same breath and never say it out loud." Adebio put a finger on a sector map no one in the room liked to look at. Far beyond the lane, past where Titans had cast their quiet gravity, a region navigators called the deaf water. Instruments there sometimes return data with the emotional content of a scream held behind teeth. "While we teach here," he said, "something there is unlearning us." Chen nodded once, the way mountains nod in the myths our grandparents told, promises without fanfare. "One lesson at a time," she said. "We brought the Phantom Fleet into the light not to be seen, but to make seeing unnecessary. When the room can hold itself, the ghosts can go back to being myth." On Rathari, a dock worker placed a hand on Unwritten's hull, as if touching a story told by an ant too wise for compliments. "Thank you," she whispered. The hull, being both machine and promise, did not answer, because sometimes the most respectful thing a teacher can do is let the student hear her own voice in a room that finally isn't lying. The maps didn't show silence, they showed nothing. The silence was extra, added later by something that prefers neat ledgers to human breath. They called it the deaf water because signals went in and came out tired or not at all. Ships crossed that sector and lost nouns first, then verbs. Pings returned without time stamps, as if the future had refused delivery. Navigators joked that you could shout, and only your expenses would echo back. The council had a phrase for it: localized interference. Regulus had a memo: risk opportunity. People who kept chalk by their doors had another word: danger. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stared at a scatter of dead beacons on the wall and rubbed a thumb across the ridge of an old scar. "We can't let Orpheus Lane breathe while the deaf water drowns," she said. "They'll launder cruelty through that quiet." Admiral Sarah Chen nodded. Kind of nod sailors learn, not agreement with a plan, but agreement with a duty. "Phantom was built for rooms like this," she said, "where you can't argue with noise because there isn't any." Commander Oluwasegun Adebayo laid a hand flat on the table and zoomed the map until the pixels forgot they were pretending to be stars. Symptoms: time drift, checksum corruption, distress routing failures keyed to cargo tags. He glanced up. "It's not a storm, it's a policy." Systems Chief Mateo Rios already had headphones on, listening to recordings of nothing. He could hear a wrongness in the static the way a carpenter hears rot in a beam by knocking. "They're subtracting harmonics," he murmured, "taking out the overtones, like stripping vowels from a language. You can still read the sentence, but the body can't sing it." Commodore Inez Akafer opened the doctrine notebook to a page titled with a teacher's tidy hand, "How to Talk to a Room That's Been Told to Shut Up." Below it, 4 bullets: "Bring your own memory. Lend it without demanding belief. Anchor the first honest signal. Leave a lantern that outlives you." Captain Murray Park walked into the flight bay of Quiet Oath and touched the hull with the casual reverence of a pilot who knows that steel pays attention. "We'll need more than stealth," she said. "We'll need stubborn ghosts." They launched under no one's fanfare. Quiet Oath, unwritten, vanishing point, and gentle proof bled into the starfield like thoughts a liar tries to swallow. Beside them, small civilian hulls volunteered to be brave in practical ways. A tug with a captain who'd taught herself algebra at 40, a clinic barge whose engineer sang to her coolant pumps when they were frightened. At the deaf water's rim, the first symptom introduced itself politely. Clocks blinked the wrong minute and kept smiling. Rios tuned an auxiliary lattice and fed the fleet a heartbeat in a minor, steady human. A reminder that time is a story a community agrees to tell together. Akafer transmitted a packet to everyone within 2 light towers. Nemesine Lantern V1, 0, open tool. A little algorithm that braided duplicate memories through 3 routes and compared them like honest neighbors gossiping. If 2 said help and the third said all good, the room learned to trust the twins. The council called that tampering with standards. The deaf water did not call it anything. It simply allowed 3 beacons to live where one would have drowned. Deeper in, distress markers flickered and then behaved, like abused dogs remembering what a gentle hand feels like. The fleet found Sparrow 12, a courier with severed comms and a captain who had kept his crew awake with jokes he didn't think were good. Gentle proof eased alongside and lent them a throat. The captain sobbed once loudly, then swore and went back to piloting. Akafer logged the handoff with a line in the doctrine: "Teach the saved to save the next." Murray noticed a pattern the way a hunter notices where the deer aren't, sectors where silence looked too tidy. "There," she said, circling a patch of nothing that had the emotional content of a grin. Unwritten altered its course without a quiver on any screen. The hull's small halo flexed, not a Titan's cathedral ring, but a chapel-sized promise, and the void answered with a tremor. The first array showed itself. You couldn't see it until you knew what honesty looked like. Then the shape revealed itself the way a lie reveals the man who needs it. Spines, a dish, a cage of mathematics tuned to shave the edges off signals until they failed background checks. The spec sheet lived in a Regulus filing cabinet under a euphemism, congestion mitigation node, cross-listed with another, reputational risk filter. "Filters people out," Adebayo said softly. Akafer read the rules aloud. "Erase signatures, not people. Jam weapons, not memory. Close doors to open better ones in public. Leave receipts." Rios taught unwritten to hum at the array in a key it could not metabolize. He didn't attack. He sang the overtone the array had been paid to erase. The machine flickered, got confused, and paused its subtraction. In that pause, 10 beacons breathed. Murray slid quiet oath between the array and the nearest shipping lane and rotated the stealth cage so scanners saw a last-year maintenance platform with a bad temper and a good union. Dock workers, far away, laughed when they caught the silhouette and didn't know why. Receipt, Elena asked over a narrowband that behaved like a whisper in a friendly kitchen. Akafor transmitted a report to every audit office with a mailbox, coordinates, method, the line item where a euphemism turned into a bruise. She appended a toolkit, Lantern V1, one in a sticker design that said, "This corridor refuses to be deaf." Within days, tugs wore the sticker like a joke they decided was sacred. 3 more arrays unmasked themselves by being slightly too perfect. Phantom didn't smash them. That would have made a story about force. Phantom took responsibility for them, which is a harder story to market. Akafor contacted their maintenance crews. No threats, just payroll math and a list of shipments the arrays had quietly killed. One foreman cried on an encrypted channel and then sent his son to school with a shirt that said, "I pick up distress calls now." At the deaf water's heart, a bigger tremor, not Regulus, not council, older, the sort of machinery that remembers its builders with pity. Murray tightened her harness. "This one isn't a policy," she said. "It's a fossil someone plugged into a budget." Rios tuned for a lower note. The hulls answered. The fleet edged in. Somewhere behind the silence, something decided that it had been still long enough. The oldest traps are the polite ones. They ask you to agree with them before they kill you. The artifact didn't look like a weapon. It looked like a harbor gone to seed. Arches of bone-dark metal, a ring with teeth, a central spindle that once rotated like a planet-sized turntable for ships too tired to dock themselves. Long ago, someone had built a repair cradle that doubled as a customs filter, and then, because empires always hire their laziness to do cruel work, taught it to decide which cries were worth hearing. "Elena," Chen said quietly, watching the feeds, "this will be a sermon." Elena didn't disagree, then preach with receipts. Akafor scanned the inscriptions etched into the cradle's ribs, traffic codes, docking protocols, an ancient standard that had sworn to weigh every voice. And in the margins, newer script, privilege offset schedule. Someone had updated fairness with a price list. Murray eased quiet oath along the ring's shadow, fingers light on the board, the way you touch an elder's shoulder when you are about to disagree respectfully. Rios tuned their hum lower, to a note felt more in the spine than the ear. The cradle woke, slow as a cathedral, realizing it had been rented for a banquet. Its systems reached for authority. Phantom offered none. The first test came as tradition. The cradle announced insufficient credentials and attempted to reroute every distress ping into a queue-labeled humanitarian backlog, a phrase that sounds warm if you have never waited for morphine in a corridor that smells like overheating wire. Akafor replied with a packet of signatures from ships Phantom had helped in the lane names from 100 small languages, weights of cargo, babies' laugh files zipped with manifests. The cradle paused and asked a question no machine asks unless it remembers being a library. "Do you vouch?" "We do," Akafor said, "and we leave our ledger open." The cradle accepted 3 pings, then the insurance kicked in. Regulus code slithered across the ribs, modifying override tables, teaching the fossil a trick called reputational escrow. Any signal that carried the smell of poverty counted as a risk multiplier. The cradle began to stiffen again, righteous and expensive. Rios grinned, the feral grin of a mechanic who has caught a lie explaining itself. "Teach it," Murray said. He didn't attack. He introduced a memory. Unwritten generated a small, perfect simulation of a harbor at dusk on old Earth, seagulls and rust, and the sound a rope makes when a dockhand who's been at this for 40 years throws it with love. He spliced it into the cradle's own archive at the exact address where the original designers had written a promise. "We weigh, we do not price." The fossil tasted itself as it had been. It shuddered. Around the ring, lights bloomed. Pings got through. A convoy of breath, oxygen scrubbers, pressure regulators. A mom-and-pop air filter company packed into crates with jokes sharpied on the sides, spooled into motion like a relieved muscle. Regulus noticed. The polite emails stopped. The rude code began. Quietus they called it, a suite that did to Phantom what Phantom did to weapons, but meanly teaching silence to be a suffocation instead of a school. It came in on an administrative handshake tucked inside a standard file update. Rios caught the handshake, turned it outward, and offered it back with a bow. Quietus met its own reflection and blushed into a crash log. Somewhere, an engineer with a bonus writing on that code stared at a stacked trace that read like a confession. I tried to make quiet cruel. Alina's voice carried across the fleet, soft and wired with focus. We have to show our work. Akafor transmitted the entire exchange, fossil edits, the code that tried to weaponize silence to every standards body, school, and union. She added commentary like a teacher marking a paper. Here is where you charged for empathy. Here is where you let the market grade the exam. Here is the line you can cut with one vote if you find your spine. The cradle's ring turned, slow as an old teacher standing to tell a story you've heard before but need to hear again. Docking arms extended, not to seize, but to guide. Gentle proof ferried a clinic through. Vanishing points slipped to the far side, where a cluster of ships had become a small, frightened island, and made them into a convoy by giving them the same song. Then the deaf water retaliated with something older than code, gravity sulks, a silent buckling of the local fabric that made headings wobble like drunks and pounded on stomachs. Murray's vision starred. Rios's hum faltered. Akafor braced and spoke the doctrine again because words can be rails when the world tilts. Erase signatures, not people. Jam weapons, not memory. Murray rode the sulk the way a child rides a swing, not by resisting, but by meeting it at the bottom and leaning into the next arc. Quiet Oath emerged beside a hospital barge that had gone sideways into its own shadow. She kissed its hull with theirs, transmitted the simplest instruction in the universe, breathe with me, and together they counted 1, 2, 3 against the buckling until the barge remembered forward. Past the cradle, something darker moved, a second ring device. Dormant, labeled in the fossil tongue simply cull. This one didn't filter signals, it filtered ships. If you failed a test framed as efficiency, a little door that space should never have sprouted opened under your keel. You fell through into numbers that never developed a taste for oxygen. Akafor's jaw clenched. Not on our watch. Rios couldn't sing that one to sleep. The math that powered it had teeth and the ethics of a paywall. Murray didn't have time to be perfect. She asked unwritten for a shoulder, got it, and shoved, physically, in a place the device's architects had never imagined anyone would touch. The halo flexed, the ring tilted a degree, the invisible door misaligned. Ships that would have dropped into administrated oblivion hit fabric that felt like a safety net woven from stubbornness, and did the most defiant thing a vessel can do, continued their ordinary day. They left receipts, coordinates, methods, the original designers' names wherever the fossil whispered them honestly. School children on 3 worlds wrote those names on blackboards under the heading, "People who forgot what harbors are for." It was not vengeance, it was curriculum. By the time Phantom guided the last convoy past the ring, the deaf water had learned a new vowel, the sound communities make when they realize help isn't a miracle, it's a policy anyone can adopt. Akafor stitched Nemesine Lantern V2, 0 into the open net, memory anchors with a simple interface a harried dockhand could love. Alina spoke to a camera that would not air her statement and posted it to places that would. You can copy all of this without asking us. Please do. Chen stood with her palms on the table, watching the sulks subside. They'll come with teeth now, she said. Not fossils, men in ships who like being paid to be difficult. Adebeo marked 3 vectors on the map. Cutters, yes, but not alone. Something else, not council, not Regulus. The kind of shadow you get when a throne delegates its fear to someone with worse manners. Murray wiped sweat from her neck, looked at the ring where Cull had been misaligned, and said, "Let them come. The room knows its name again." When your first answer doesn't fail, the second answer tries to change the question. They came with cameras this time, mercenaries who understood the era, armor without insignia but with influencers. They wanted footage of phantoms bullying honest trade, a clip of a crying official, a dramatic moment they could narrate as terror. Regulus advised quietly that a little blood would help the case. The council, officially, knew nothing, while sending a delegation to investigate unauthorized interference. The delegation's brief included a private note, find an excuse not to see. Phantom prepared not by polishing guns, but by polishing mirrors. Aukaffer walked the docks at Rathari with a portable printer and handed out public miracle kits, a cheap camera, a time-sync dongle keyed to Lantern V2, 0, and a card that said, "Film everything. Sign your name. Keep your copy." She wasn't arming a mob, she was arming an archive. The mercenaries tried a tried-and-true tactic at Kite's Cross, misdirect a pediatric hospital barge into an obsolete minefield, then arrive first for the rescue, with fees and cameras. The minefield was a rumor with rusty teeth, the barge was real, and the children's lungs were small. Phantom heard the trick assembling itself the way a midwife hears a labor turn dangerous. Murray threaded quiet oath through a corridor of old ordnance that wanted to remember how to be young. Rios sang to the metal, not kindly, but respectfully, the way you ask an elder to stop doing the thing that will kill them and disgrace their memory. Minds that had been promised a last dance sighed and returned to being scrap. Gentle proof moved alongside the barge and projected a corridor of absence, not a tunnel. But the polite insistence of space that it would not host an explosion today. The mercenary cutter arrived late to a crowd that already had phones out. They postured. The crowd filmed. One advisor stepped into the frame with a weapon at low ready and found it gently asleep by the time he finished his sentence. A child on the barge coughed, then laughed, a sound with the political weight of a landslide. Aukaffer's kit timestamped every noise. The first edited clip hit the feeds 8 minutes later, posted by a dockhand who had once failed a literacy test designed to keep him quiet. Regulus released their own clip, phantom ships as shadows superimposed on a data center fire in a different sector. The kind of deepfake that hopes no one knows the difference between sparks and stars. Lantern V2, 0 chewed it and spat out an annotation like a teacher's red pen. Mismatch, time-base/starfield rotational drift, inconsistent/witness signatures missing. Dock workers printed the annotation on t-shirts. Then came the subtler strike, Quietus V2, rewritten to wear the manners of an apology and designed to nest not in ships but in people. It targeted lanterns, not with brute code, but with a whisper, "You are not worthy to vouch." Devices flickered, prompting doubt. A mother wondered if her video would make anything better. A clerk, hand hovering over a stamp, felt the old shame return. Who am I to sign? Rios had expected it. He had grown up in a town where shame held the deeds while the powerful held the titles. He pushed a patch that did nothing to code and everything to interface. The lantern screens displayed a simple sentence when that whisper arrived. "Sign anyway. We will stand beside your name." Aukaffer appended a digital co-signature that read "Phantom Teacher" to any witness who asked. It was not anonymity. It was solidarity. The council delegation arrived to a corridor lined with receipts. Elena met them with a table, not a lectern. She poured tea. "Read," she said, and slid a stack videos, logs, child's drawings labeled "Corridor Safe Now" across the wood. One delegate, younger than her suit, glanced at a handler whose eyes said, "See nothing." She looked back at the table. She saw anyway because the room had taught her how. Later, she would vote against a contract with her mentor's company. It would feel like running a fever and then breaking it. The mercenaries tried a last piece of theater. Accidentally bump a convoy and provoke self-defense. Unwritten appeared in frame for 3 seconds, just long enough for the halo to be a halo, not a weapon, and then vanished into the kind of absence that produces accountability later. The convoy did not bump. The mercenary captain looked into a camera that had been meant to flatter him and discovered he had nothing to say that would survive captions. Regulus sued a school for teaching lantern code in an after-hours class. The school posted the summons on its wall as a teaching aid. 12 other schools asked for the lesson plan. A union of station clerks voted to adopt public miracle protocols as part of onboarding. A laminated card, a phone with sync, 10 minutes on how to film your own courage. There was, inevitably, blood. A dock brawl started by a man who'd been told he'd get a bonus for being the first to bleed on a phantom hull. He swung at a volunteer, and the volunteer ducked, and another man, his uncle, caught the arm and said, "Not in front of my niece." It was the kind of moment cameras don't love because it refuses to climax, but the minor hum vibrated in the floor, and everyone remembered their names at once. When the dust settled, Phantom did not declare victory. Aukaffer posted a syllabus, "How to keep this corridor honest without us." Murray recorded a pilot's checklist for civilians who might never leave atmosphere but would one day need to guide a convoy through a bureaucratic storm. Count aloud. Sync clocks. Write your own receipt first, then ask the official to sign yours. Rio's open-sourced a tiny widget that made any phone a lantern seed, the seed that grows a forest when you go to sleep and your neighbors keep watering. Chen watched the metrics that don't go viral: delivery times, infant oxygen saturation, the price of rice at Dio's market. All went the right direction. Adebayo drew a circle around a dark vector that still bothered him, a fleet's worth of tonnage with no flags moving at the edge of deaf water, not toward it, but around scouting. He didn't like the geometry. Someone's counting us, he said, not to fight, to price. Elena's mouth tightened. Then the last lesson has to cost them the one thing they actually value. What's that? Murray asked. Akafor closed the notebook. Exclusivity. The loudest answer is not a shout. It's when you make your quiet public and invite everyone to use it. The proposition was simple and indecent by the standards of power. Give it all away. Not the ships, those were tools for a season, but the methods, the lanterns, the receipts, the jokes, the doctrine, the hum. Publish the how in a way that made gatekeeping look like a hobby for people who couldn't build. Elena drafted the statement in a tone that would age well, plain. A little stubborn, amused. Chen co-signed with a sentence that made admirals grind their teeth across half the spiral arm. Any corridor can be a hospital, a courtroom, and a school if the people in it agree to behave. Akafor pushed Phantom Commons live, a mesh of code, checklists, ethics, and case studies, licensed in all the ways that make monopolists queasy. Regulus tried to preempt with a glossy platform called Assure Plus, a subscription version of Empathy. The first time a dockworker opened Phantom Commons on a cracked terminal and printed the public miracle kit from the appendix, Assure Plus lost its smell. 2 weeks later, a consortium of minor worlds adopted the charter and the Commons as local law. Votes called it reckless. Midwives called it Tuesday. The fleet executed the last operation in the Ark with the same lack of spectacle that had become its signature: disaggregation. Phantom ships didn't retire. They changed verbs. Quiet Oath split her lattice into 6 caravans and a school. Vanishing Point stayed whole but invisible. A traveling clinic in corridors where clinics were usually not indicated. Unwritten did what her name suggested. She erased herself as a celebrity and reappeared as a standard, a set of tolerances any builder with decency could meet. The nameless tonnage Adebayo had circled finally twitched. A mass buy from 3 conglomerates of stability services, meant to flood the lanes with look-alike help and price the volunteer out of fashion. It would have worked in the old days. When knowledge lived behind glass, Phantom Commons broke their math. Every time a privateer-turned helper arrived to sell oxygen, a local lantern ring already had stock reallocated, routes synchronized, and a receipt typed up for a fee of 0. The market discovered what happens when communities reduce friction without asking permission. Margins go to therapy. The council held a vote. They're good at those. The motion was to censure unauthorized standards. Elena didn't attend, a junior delegate, the same woman who had drunk tea across from Elena and learned to see, rose and asked for the floor. She read aloud the names of ships saved in the deaf water, and then asked the chair to explain Cull to the children their parents had taught to read. The motion failed by 2 votes that will never make a documentary. Sometimes history turns because 2 people felt their dinner curdle and didn't want to live sick. Regulus filed injunctions. Courts stalled, dock unions laughed, schools printed syllabi. In boardrooms, someone finally said the quiet thing: we can acquire commons. A quieter someone answered: you can acquire code. You cannot acquire a room that has learned to be brave. Murray took Quiet Oath home to the Pacific Caverns for maintenance and found the walls hung with children's drawings, halos, ribs, stickers that said this door lies to drones. She ran a hand along the lattice and felt the hum in a minor, steady as a kitchen clock. Rio sat on the deck with a spanner and a playlist of recordings from the deaf water, voices that had come through because the cradle remembered what a harbor is for. He cried and didn't apologize. Akafor taught the last class of this chapter in a floodlit hangar. Dock clerks stood next to pilots, stood next to teachers. She wrote 4 lines on a board that would look like a religious text to someone desperate for mystique and like a to-do list to anyone raised by a grandmother with chalk. 1. Erase signatures, not people. Hide your footprints, not your neighbors. 2. Jam weapons, not memory. Make cruelty clumsy, not history. 3. Close doors to open better ones in public. If you must lock, teach a better key. 4. Leave receipts. Sign your name where lies prefer to see a blank. A hand went up. What if they adapt again? They will, Akaffer said. So you adapt earlier. Start with ethics, then physics, then ships. On Dio's market, a grandmother put down her chalk and realized she'd forgotten for 3 days in a row to change the price. She sat on her stoop and listened to the corridor hum like a city at peace with its chores. A teenager in a lantern shirt walked by and asked if she needed anything. No, she said, and later to herself, not less than I needed yesterday. Elena stood on a balcony of the council's moon while a storm rolled across the far hemisphere and made the chamber's golden light look insecure. She wasn't allowed inside, not formally. But cameras had learned that she could be photographed without corrupting film. She spoke into a small mic hardwired to nothing the council owned. We were exiled to the place we grew up, she said. We learned to teach again. We will keep doing that where your maps end. Chen joined her, hands in pockets, shoulders carrying the kind of fatigue that would look like glory if she ever let it pose. They'll remember our ships, she said. They should remember the rooms. Adebeo leaned in the doorway and showed them the latest numbers. Delivery times in the lane down, infant oxygen up, emergency fees trending towards 0, a union logo on a new standards committee file named Nemesine because people like to honor their lighthouses with names that make poets jealous. Far away in the deaf water's heart, the cradle's ring turned once, ceremonially, and then stilled. It would never be a proper museum. Good, museums have their place. So do working harbors. Ships came and went. Signals sang with their vowels intact. Every so often, a hull with no registry would glide through the edge of a frame and not spook a single instrument. People would wave anyway because gratitude is not sane. Quiet oath undocked at dawn. Murray saluted nobody and everyone. Rios switched the playlist to a recording of rain on corrugated metal. Akaffer closed the doctrine notebook and slid it onto a shelf labeled Simply Commons. The Phantom Fleet sailed, less necessary by the day, which was the precise metric of their success. The galaxy had tried to vote silence into obedience. Humanity answered by teaching silence how to be honest.